Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to my 2026 library tour. In this episode, I begin the science fiction and fantasy section of my library. Currently, my science fiction and fantasy collection is out in the hall. I have a small bookcase that is piled with science fiction and fantasy, and this spills over onto two boxes and into two boxes. For a long time, science fiction and fantasy, more fantasy than science fiction, was my favorite genre. But over the last 6 years, I have fallen out of love with science fiction and fantasy and have been working to downsize my science fiction and fantasy collection. Although it hasn't quite worked out. So this part of the tour is going to focus on the books that are on top of the boxes that I intended for donation or to trade into a used bookstore. But yeah. And some of these books probably should go onto the shelves that I would want to keep. Starting with this first one, Radiance, by Catherine M. Valenti. This is a weird science fiction novel that takes place in an very alternate solar system in which the planets are much closer and all of them, including Pluto, are habitable. Radiance is about a filmmaker named Severin Unk who makes documentaries. And her last documentary is the exploration of what happened to a village on Venus. And the novel kind of follows what happened, her father's struggle to come to terms with her death by making a film of it, and other things. It's a very weird science fiction novel that for a number of years was one of my favorite science fiction novels of the last 10 years. Next is an anthology, Swords and Dark Magic, The New Sword and Sorcery, edited by Jonathan Strahan and Lou Anders. So this is a really good anthology of new sword and sorcery from the last 20 or so years. Came out in the early 2000s during one of the last sword and sorcery flourishings. Sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy that every few decades gets renewed interest before going back into obscurity. But this is really good. Another anthology I have, actually, a good chunk of what this pile is anthologies. This is the very best of fantasy and science fiction, edited by Gordon Van Gelder. So this collection features stories from 60 years of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I remember some of the stories in here as being rather good, although I have not reread this anthology in quite some time. So my opinion very well could have changed. The next two, and then there'll be a skip, I think, and then the next two are edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. First up is The New Weird. So, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a brief new genre of science fiction and fantasy called The New Weird that combined elements of steampunk and other subgenres of science fiction and fantasy. And the Vandermeers, Jeff Vandermeer, whose own work is very much New Weird or whatever came after it, sort of is called to this genre. So this anthology, I remember being pretty good. Particularly, I think the Lizard of Ooze and The Gutter Sees the Light That Never Shines. I remember fondly. Next is steampunk. So steampunk is a more enduring recent subgenre of science fiction and fantasy. And the Vandermeers had 2 volumes of this anthology. I think my favorite was The God Clown is Near by J. Lake. But it's been a long time since I read this. Or The New Weird. Of course, given the fact that I'm not really all that happy with science fiction and fantasy right now, it makes sense. Next is New Suns, original speculative fiction by people of color, edited by Nisi Shaw. This is a pretty good anthology, if I remember correctly. So the next 2 are big anthologies. The first one bigger than the second one. This is the Big Book of Science Fiction, edited, of course, by Ann and Jeff Vandermeer. So this is a massive collection of science fiction short stories that run from, I think assuming, of course, it wants to cooperate, from the early 20th century through to, I want to say, either 2010 or the late 2000s or very early 2010s. I think this came out about 9 or 10 or more years ago. I also have the first volume of the Big Book of Classic Fantasy. Well, technically, the fantasy version of the Big Book of Fantasy is in 2 volumes. The Classic Fantasy, and then there's a second one. And I haven't really looked too much into this one, I have to say. I wasn't too fond of the Big Book of Science Fiction. There were a few good stories in there, if I remember, but a good chunk of it I didn't particularly care for. So, next pile. Next up is another anthology, Universe 10, edited by Terry Carr. This is one of a number of yearly anthologies that came out and still come out that look at the best of a year's worth of science fiction. This is the Universe series, but I guess Terry Carr edited for at least 10 years. This volume is one that Steve Donahue highly recommends, although I did not have nearly the luck that he did. This is The Door into Fire by Diane Duane. I have not read this novel. Not entirely sure if I will ever get to it, given, of course, that I'm not all that into science fiction and fantasy at the moment. The Once and Featured King by T.H. White. Have not gotten around to this yet either. Chasm City by Alistair Reynolds. It's been a very long time since I read it. I did remember it fondly, but of course that's been like well over a decade. The next batch are Dune books. First up is Dune itself by Frank Herbert. This is a classic of science fiction, and I have decidedly mixed relationship with it. when I first read it, I rather enjoyed it, even if I did have my issues with it. And subsequent rereads, I haven't enjoyed it as much, if at all. This is God Emperor of Dune, which is the fourth book in the series. I also have Children of Dune and Dune Messiah. I think a few years ago on BookTube, there was a Dune reading event that at least got up to God Emperor of Dune, if not the other two books in the series. I don't quite remember. But those four I would probably keep. This is the first book by Robert E. Howard that's going to show up, The Black Stranger and Other American Tales. So this is a random collection of American horror stories, or America set or inspired horror stories by Robert E. Howard. I haven't really read this one. And this is I'm not entirely sure what the hell this is, by William Gibson. It's Burning Chrome. So one story in here, at least, is Burning Chrome, which I remember quite fondly. So there's some short stories in here. And then there are, I think, might be some nonfiction pieces as well. I don't know. I have not actually read this. Okay, the final pile. So the first batch of books are the Gormenghast trilogy. So this is Titus Alone, which is the third book in the trilogy. All of them are by Marvin Peake. I have not actually read any of them. So this is Gormenghast, which is the second book in the trilogy. And the first book in the trilogy is Titus Groan. The next two books are by Fritz Leiber. First is The Best of Fritz Leiber, which is a short story collection. Not too fond of it. I also have The Three of Swords, which is an omnibus edition that includes Swords and Deviltry, Swords Against Death, and Swords in the Mist. I think there might be a few other Fafhrd and Grey Mouser short story collections, but I just only have this one. And I haven't read this in a very long time. So the next batch are Michael Moorcock, Sailor on the Seas of Fate. Oh, this is an Elric novel. Probably got from Golden's Book Exchange. Stormbringer. Also probably got it from Golden's Book Exchange. Oh wait, this isn't Michael Moorcock. This is Samuel R. Delany. This is The Fall of the Towers, which I believe is an omnibus edition that includes Out of the Dead City, The Towers of Toron, and City of a Thousand Suns, none of which I have read. And then this is Hawkmoon by Michael Moorcock. So this is an anthology that includes The Jewel in the Skull, The Maggod's Amulet, The Sword of Dawn, and The Rune Staff. I think I tried The Jewel in the Skull a long time ago and didn't get on with it, but for some odd reason, I decided to add this to my collection. There was a period of time when I was in the throes of my science fiction and fantasy love that I wanted to have a lot of classics in the genre, and that's why I picked it up, even if I didn't really get on with at least the first book. This is Dahlgren by Samuel R. Delany. This is a classic post-apocalyptic novel. I tried it more than 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, and didn't get on with it. Haven't gone back to it since, despite wanting to at points. And yeah, I haven't gotten rid of it. Probably won't. So the next three books are the Conan collection by Robert E. Howard. So about more than 20 years, about 26 years ago, Del Rey put out the entirety of the Conan stories, and I think all of Robert E. Howard's work that's fantasy or fantasy adjacent. So I have the Conan trilogy of collections. First is The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. I think the second one is The Bloody Crown of Conan. And the final volume is The Conquering Sword of Conan. But I could be wrong on the second and third volumes. Oh yeah, this is the last one. Because there's a lot more miscellaneous stuff in here. So this would be the last one. So I think all of these at one time, got rid of them, and then recollected them. And I don't think I'm going to get rid of them. So I need to find some space on the shelf for them. I also have 2 China medieval novels in this little pile. First is Perdido Street Station. This is the first novel in the Boss Log trilogy, and is quite good despite my last attempt at rereading it. I also have Iron Council, which is the 3rd volume in the Boss Log trilogy, and I think universally agreed the weakest of them. So that concludes the first part of science fiction and fantasy. I'm going to, well, actually, now that I think about it, I could do so this is the conclusion of the first part of my science fiction and fantasy section of my library. I was going to put this group of books onto the floor, but actually I've got a good spot to put them temporarily. The next 2 episodes will feature the books in the boxes, and then the other batch of carryover books, and then I'll get to the bookshelves themselves, which I'm not totally sure how I'm going to do that. I guess probably what I'll do is I'll get a little table to put my laptop on and film it that way. And then maybe try to do 2 episodes or 2 halves in one go, but separate them out or something. You will find out once I figure it out and film it. Anyway, BookTube, I will see you tomorrow with a book haul. So until then, thank you. Well, when I upload this video shortly thereafter, there will be a book haul. But I'm filming this on Sunday night. Anyway, I'm starting to waffle, so I will talk to you later. So until then, thank you, BookTube.